We continue now at the top of Daf Chaf Aleph Amad Aleph and Meseches Avodah Zara. This is Avodah Zarah Daf 21a. This Daf is sponsored by David Grossman. Thank you for your sponsorship. If you'd like to sponsor an Avodah Daf, see the description box below to see how you can support this channel. On the previous Amud, the Mishnah said that in Eretz Yisrael you cannot rent to Ovdei Kochavim houses or fields, but in Syria, Maskirin Lehem Batim, you could rent to them houses, Avolo Sados, but not fields. Uva Chutz La'aretz, and in Chutz La'aretz, outside of Eretz Yisrael, Mochrin Lehem Batim, you can sell to them houses, Umaskirin Sados, and you can rent to them fields. Divrei Rebbe Meir, these are the words of Rebbe Meir. And Rashi explains, Maskirin Lehem Batim, you could rent to them houses, Velo Gazrinan Atu Mechira, we do not make a gezerah that you might come to sell them houses in Syria. Diinami Osili De Mechira Lo Avar Doraisa, because even if you would sell them houses in Syria, that's not a transgression on a Doraisa level. Techiksiv Lo Sitan Lehem Chein V'chania, because again, that pasuk Lo Sechonim, where we learn this Doraisa not to sell to them the houses, Be'eretz Yisrael Ksiv, that's talking in Eretz Yisrael. Techashi V'chaniasa, the encampment, so to speak, in Eretz Yisrael, is considered chashuv, it's considered important. Umiu, now nevertheless, mechira lechatchila lo, to sell lechatchila in Syria, that we won't allow, to gazrinan misham mechira d'Eretz Yisrael, because there we do make a gezerah, because you might come to sell in Eretz Yisrael. Avalo sados, but again, in Syria, you're not allowed to rent to them fields, the ikatarti li-sura, Rashi mentioned this on the previous Amud, there's two reasons for the prohibition. V'chutz la'aretz, and then outside of Eretz Yisrael, the merachik, meaning far away, v'leka lemigzar mechira d'hasam atu mechira d'Eretz Yisrael, there you don't need to make a gezerah selling there because of selling in Eretz Yisrael. That's why it's okay to sell houses over there. And again, Rabbi Meir said that you can rent fields in Chutz La'aretz. As Rashi continues and explains, Mochrin Batim Umaskirin Sados, again in Chutz La'aretz you can sell the houses and rent the fields. Avol Mechira de Sados Lo, you can't go so far as to sell the fields, Kevan Di Katarti, since there's two reasons for the prohibition, Gazrinan, therefore we make a Gezerah. And the Mishnah continues, Rabbi Yossi Omer, Rabbi Yossi says, Be'eretz Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael, Maskirin Lehem Batim, we are able to rent to them houses, Avolo Sados, but not fields. You see, Rabbi Yossi is a little bit more lenient. Uvesuria Mochrin Batim, and in Syria you can even sell houses, Maskirin Sados, and you can rent the fields. Uvechutz la'aretz, and outside of Eretz Yisrael, Mochen Elu ve'elu, you can sell these and those. You can sell everything. And Rashi explains time with Rabbi Yossi Mefarish b'Gemara. The reason behind what Rabbi Yossi is saying, that's all explained in the Gemara. And the Mishnah continues, Af b'makom sha'amru lahaskir, even in places where they said it's permissible to rent to them, lo lebeis dira amru, they weren't saying that it's permissible to rent them houses that they should live there, meaning as a residence, because then the idol worshiper is going to bring the idols into there. Shenamar, as it says in the pasuk, lo savi to'evel beisecha, you can't bring the abomination into your house. Uvechol makom lo yasker lo hamerchotz, and in all places he should not rent to him a bathhouse, mimneshu nikra al shemo, because that's called by his name. And Rashi explains, af b'makom shamru lahasker, even in places where they said it's permitted to rent batim, to rent houses to the Ovdei Kochavim, lo lebeis dira amru, it's not permissible to rent it to them as a residence, ela lishtamushe behu betzivi v'tivna, rather it's just to use it to store things like wood and straw. And mimneshu nikra al shemo, it's a problem to rent the bathhouse to the Ovdei Kochavim, because the bathhouse is called after his name, meaning it's still referred to as the Jews' bathhouse. And when people see that they're using this bathhouse on Shabbos, they're going to say that the attendants at the bathhouse are actually the agents of the Jew, and that's going to be problematic. And the Gemara says, what does the Mishnah mean when it says that we don't even need to say that you can't rent them fields? Again, it sounds like fields are worse than houses. If you're going to say it's because there are two problems when it comes to fields. One, you're giving them chanias karka. Again, they have encampment in the land. You're not supposed to sell them land, and so therefore you shouldn't rent to them either. And then additionally, the kamifka lami meiser, because by renting them the field, you're now taking it away in terms of the obligations of meiser. Those obligations are not going to be taken care of. But if so, batim nami, when it comes to houses as well, ikotarti, you have two problems over there also. Chada chanias karka. Number one, you have again the problem of chanias karka. You're giving them these houses. And additionally, you're taking away the obligation of mezuzah. And the Gemara says to that, Amar of Misharshia says, mezuzah chovas hadaru. When it comes to mezuzah, that is an obligation upon the person who lives in the house. And Rashi explains chovas hadaru, that's an obligation upon the person who lives in the house. The lo chovas habayis, the point over here is that it's not an obligation upon the house itself. Hilkach lekaf kata, therefore you're not really taking away any obligation, because it has to be your house, derech biyascha, that you enter into. Alma lamisha nichnas v'yotze l'socha azar achmana. The warning is on the person who's going and coming from the house, and so therefore, when it comes to a house, so if you rent the house to a non-Jew, so there is no obligation. You're not taking away any obligation in terms of mezuzah, but when it comes to the field, the obligation is upon the field, and so therefore that is more problematic. And we will take a look at Tosis over here. Ha'amar of Mesharshia mezuzah chovas hadari. Again, Mesharshia says that mezuzah is an obligation of the one who lives there. Perish, the explanation of the Gemara is as follows: V'im kainin, if so, ein ligzor behu sechirus atu mechir. We don't need to make a gezerah by renting because of selling. De mechira lo mifka lo mi mezuzah, because even when you sell, by the case of a house, you're not uprooting from mezuzah because it's a chovas hadar. Avol besados b'mechir, but when it comes to selling a field, mifka lahu mi meiser. So then you actually are uprooting the obligations of Meiser. And Tosas explained, V'yesh mefarshim, there are those who explain, the asya afilu leman do amar ein kinyan lover kochavim beretz Yisrael hafkia miyad Meiser. This Gemara is going even according to the one who says that an ovid kochavim does not have a kinyan in Eretz Yisrael to uproot it from the obligations of Meiser. There is a machlokis whether when the ovid kochavim purchases land in Eretz Yisrael that uproots the obligations of Meiser or not. Tosas now is suggesting even if you hold it does not uproot the obligations of Meiser, this Gemara still works. Besof hasholeach, this is found at the end of Perak HaSholech and Gittin. To mikol makam chashuva hafka, it's still considered an uprooting of the obligation of Meisers. Mashi ata biyad ovid kochavim, because right now the land is in the possession of the ovid kochavim of the idol worshipper. V'hu zora she'eno mafresh mimena Meiser, and he's planting it and he's not separating Meiser. Nimsa she'en mekaymin bozeh hasada mitzvah hatzaluya ba. The explanation would then be that it comes out that he's not fulfilling with this field the mitzvah which is upon this field, that obligation to separate Meiser. Aval bayis, but when it comes to a house, ein kan hafka, that's not called a hafka. Mimnei she'ein habayis atzmo chayiv, because the house itself is not chayiv at all. Kevan she'ein Yisrael dar b'socho, since there's no Jew living within it. But Tosa say v'lo nehira, that explanation doesn't seem to be correct. Dim kain mai kamer b'samach l'Rabbi Yossi, because if that's the case, what does the Gemara mean when in coming up according to Rabbi Yossi? Saded di is beitarti gazru rabbanan schiras atu mechira, that by a field where you have both problems, so there's a gezerah by schiras, by renting because of selling. Halo b'schiras gufa ikatarti, but by renting itself, according to this explanation, you have two problems renting it as well. The v'schiras gufa ika hafkami meiser, because let's say you rent it to the non-Jew, so isn't that an uprooting from Meiser? Shlo yeyaser ha'ovid kochavim meyosa tvu, because the ovid kochavim, the non-Jew, is not going to separate Meiser. V'yor kash, and furthermore it's difficult, the lashon hafka, the language of hafka, mashma shemafkia hachiyav legamri min hakarka, that sounds like you're totally uprooting the obligation, like there's no obligation at all. V'kan ein hafka gemur, but if you're holding ein kinyan lovid kochavim, there's not a full hafka. Kevan de ein kinyan, because there is no kinyan. Sharei gamata shu biyad hovid kochavim, because right now, even right now, when it's in the hands of the ovid kochavim, im yizra bo Yisrael, if a Jew would plant there, tis chayiv la'aser, there would be an obligation to take off Meiser. And so therefore Tosas explain, Lakach nira lafarish, therefore it appears to explain as follows, Tiyasya commandamar yesh kinyan. Our Gemara is following the one who says that when the non-Jew owns the property, he is uprooting it from the obligations of Meisers. Ukeshamocher lovet kochavim hu mafkia mamish mi Meiser. When it's sold to the non-Jew, to the idol worshipper, it's completely uprooted from Meiser. Shafilu yizra Yisrael, even if a Jew were to plant there, lo yeschayim b'Meiser, there would be no obligation of Meiser. But Tosas continue, Aval bayis, but when it comes to a house, Vaday enu mafkia min mezuzah, he's certainly not uprooting it from the obligation of mezuzah. Dafilu lo yimkarenu lovid kochavim, because even if he wouldn't have sold it to an ovid kochavim, ela shelo yoder bo Yisrael, just that a Jew wouldn't live there, ein kan chiyuv mezuzah min haTorah. There's no chiyuv mezuzah from the Torah. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Besuria maskirin bottom, in Syria, we're allowed to rent out houses to the ovdei kochavim. And the Gemara says, Ma'ishna mechira delo. What's the reason that selling, you're not allowed to do that in Syria? Mishum mechira de Eretz Yisrael, because then you might come to sell in Eretz Yisrael. So if so, mischiras nami. When it comes to schiras as well, nigzor, we should make that gezer, and we should say again, you might come to do it in Eretz Yisrael. And the Gemara continues and answers, he gufa gezerah, because schiras in Eretz Yisrael itself is a gezerah, as we mentioned above. V'anon nekom v'nigzor gezerah legezerah. We're going to get up and make a gezerah on a gezerah, and so that's why in Syria, specifically, we prohibit mechira, but we're not going to prohibit schiras. And the Gemara continues, v'schiras sadeh, but what about the renting of a field? The v'Syria, the gezerah legezerah, that's in Syria, and that's a gezerah on another gezerah, v'kagazrinon, and that we do make that gezerah. And the Gemara answers to that, Hasam lav gezerah here over there. It actually is not a gezerah, because kasavar kibush yochid shmei kibush, and so that because the Tan of our Mishnah holds that the kibush yochid, again, that's the conquering of an individual. David HaMelech conquered that area, is considered that it's a conquered area, and so therefore sadeh de ispeitarti gazru bei rabbanon. Again, when it comes to a field, there are two issues, so the rabbanon make the gezerah. Bottom de less butarti, but when it comes to houses where there are not two issues, lo gazru buhu rabbanon, there the rabbanon do not make the gezerah. And Rashi explains, he gufa gezerah, it itself is a gezerah, meaning schirus atu mechira in Eretz Yisrael. There's a gezerah on schirus because of mechira. And the Gemara then asked, schirus sados, but what about the renting of fields? The Surya in Surya, the gezerah la gezerah, that is a gezerah to another gezerah. The kasalka daitach, because right now the Gemara thinks, mishum schirus de Eretz Yisrael, it's that the reason why schirus sados in Surya is aser is because of the schirus of sados in Eretz Yisrael, which again is a derabanan. And the Gemara answered Shmei Kivush that really the conquering of David HaMelech, the Kibush Yochid, is considered a conquering. Uvemechira de Surya iko isur, and therefore when it comes to selling in Surya, there is an isur, bein batim, bein sados. There's going to be an isur on a doraisa level, whether you're talking about houses or fields. Hilkach schirus sados de Surya, therefore when it comes to the renting out of fields in Surya, lav gezerah hi misham schirus de Eretz Yisrael. It's not a gezerah because of schirus in Eretz Yisrael. Ela misham mechiros sados de lav gezerah. Rather, it's because of selling the fields, which is not a gezerah. Ela isur doraisa, that's an isur doraisa. Umiu lo achmor barabonon lemigzar schiras debatim atu mechira. However, when it comes to the renting of houses because of the selling of houses, that the rabbanon were not so strict about, because again, avol sados de ikotarti, where you have again two issues when it comes to fields, as we mentioned above. You have the issue of chanias karka, as we said, and also mifka lo mimaiser. So therefore, gazru schiras atu mechira. That's why they made a gezerah by schiras, because of mechira. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, again, according to Rabbi Meir, b'chutz la'aretz, that outside of Eretz Yisrael, so when it comes to houses, you can even sell the houses, and when it comes to fields, you can rent the fields. And the Gemara explains, sadeh de ispeitarti, again, when it comes to a field which has two problems, gazru b'hu rabbanan, so there, the rabbanan make a gezerah, they say you can't sell. But bottom, when it comes to houses, the less butarti, where you don't have two issues, lo gazru b'hu rabbanan, over there, the rabbanan did not make a gezerah. Rashi explains, again, fields with two problems, so the Rabbanan make a gezerah de maskirin velo mochrin. You can rent it out, but you can't sell. Mishum mechir de Eretz Yisrael, and that's because of selling in Eretz Yisrael. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Rabbi Yossi Omer, Rabbi Yossi says, Be'eretz Yisrael, maskirin lehem batim v'chulu. In Eretz Yisrael, you can rent to them houses. In general, Rabbi Yossi was more lenient than Rabbi Meir in all of these cases. And the Gemara says, my time, and what's the reason of Rabbi Yossi? Sados di isbu tardi, fields which have two problems. Gazru buhu rabbanan, there the rabbanan made the decree. Bottom de les butarti, but when it comes to houses where there are not two problems, just one problem, lo gazru buhu rabbanan, there the rabbanan do not make a decree. And Rashi explains, Rabbi Yossi Omer, Be'eretz Yisrael, maskirim lehem batim, in Eretz Yisrael, according to Rabbi Yossi, you can rent to them houses. V'lo gazrinan atu mechira, we don't make a decree because of mechira. Avol sados de'ika b'mechirasan tarti lisura, when it comes to fields where when you sell them there are two issues in terms of isser, in terms of prohibition. So gazrinan sechiros atu mechira, therefore we do make a gezerah of sechiros because of mechira. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Rabbi Yossi again continued of Surya mochrin v'chulu, and in Surya you can sell. And my time, and what's the reason of Rabbi Yossi? Kasavar, because Rabbi Yossi holds kibush yochid lo shmei kibush. He holds that the conquering of an individual is not considered to be conquering, so it's not really considered like Eretz Yisrael. And so therefore, v'sadeh di isba tarti, when it comes to a field where you have two problems, gazru bar rabbanan, so there we make a gezerah. Bottom de les butarti, when it comes to houses where you don't have two issues, lo gazru buhu rabbanan, so there the rabbanan do not make a gezerah. And Rashi explains, Hachi Garsinon, the proper text is as follows, Kasavar kibush yachid lav shmei kibush. He holds that the conquering of an individual is not conquering. Hilkach leka isura b'mechiras batim. Therefore, when it comes to selling houses, you don't have an isur doraisa. And so therefore, sados de isbuhu tarti. So when it comes to fields with two issues, gazru buhu rabbanan mechirasan besurya. So there the rabbanan say that selling them is problematic in Surya. Atu mechir d'Eretz Yisrael, because of mechir in Eretz Yisrael. But when it comes to houses, even the sale in Surya is going to be permitted. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said that according to Rabbi Yossi, uv'chutz la'aretz mochrin v'chulu, that in Chutzlarts you can sell houses and fields. And the Gemara says, my time, and what's the reason of Rabbi Yossi? Kevin de merchak lo gazrinan, since Chutzlarts is far away from Eretz Yisrael, so there is no gezerah. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, halacha Rav Yossi, the halacha is like Rav Yossi, that we can be lenient, you can sell houses and fields outside of Eretz Yisrael. Amar Rav Yosef, and Rav Yosef says, as long as you don't make it into a settlement of Ovdei Kochavim, as long as you don't make it into a settlement of idol worshippers. The Gemara says, V'kam shchuna, now how many people does it take to make it a shchuna, to make it a settlement? Tana was taught, Ein shchuna pchusa mishlosha b'nei adam. It's not a shchuna if it has less than 3 people. You have to have at least 3 people for it to be a shchuna. The Gemara continues and asks, but still, v'leichash, we should be concerned. Dil ma'azal ha-Yisrael u'mazvan l'chad. Maybe this Jew is going to go and he's going to sell a house to one l'chad over kochavim, to one non-Jew. V'yazal heichu ma'azvan lo l'trei. And now this over kochavim is going to go ahead and sell it to 2 others, divide up the property, and then you're going to have a shchuna. Why are we concerned with that? Amar Abaya says, alifnei mifagdinan. This is a reference to lifnei iver, by lifnei iver, so we're saying you can't put a stumbling block directly in front of the blind. But alifnei de lifnei lo mifagdinan. But before that, we're not worried about, meaning if you're one step removed, if you're doing something which will then cause a stumbling block, that's not a problem. So similarly over here, if you're going to sell, let's say, to one over kocham, the fact that eventually might turn it into a shchuna is not going to be an issue. Rashi explains, you're allowing him to sell to one over kochavim, so maybe we should be concerned that Yisrael is going to go, he's going to sell to one, and then that over kochavim is going to sell to 2 others. He's going to keep a little for himself, he'll give to another 2, and then you're going to have a situation where you have a shchuna. And so the Gemara said to that, mifakdinan garsinan, again we're commanded about lifnei, but alifnei de lifnei, kilomar l'kuli hai lo chayshinan. The Gemara just means to say, we're not going to be concerned to that extent. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. The Mishnah said, Af b'makom sha'amru lahaskir, even in places where they say that you can rent. The idea over here was that you're allowed to rent the houses, but not as a residence, because they're going to bring in idols. And the Gemara says, Mechlal di'iko duchta delom mugri. That sounds like it's saying that there are places where one would not rent, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chaf Aleph Amid Beis.